Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sitrep for Wednesday, the 10th of December, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Big thanks to Jared and Robert for filling in while I was gone. Just briefly, I was really sick over Thanksgiving, and I'm getting better now. So thanks, gentlemen, and let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway with Robert. Robert, let's start with this latest CISA note that came out last night at 8 p.m. or so. They're warning that hacktivists, not necessarily the Russian government or Russian military or Russian cyber units, but Russian hacktivists are targeting infrastructure, including inside the United States. Not a lot new here, but this is their latest warning. So what did they say?
Good morning, Mike. So yeah, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency sent out this joint warning, and they're saying that these pro-Russia hacktivists, they're targeting global critical infrastructure, and what they're doing is taking advantage of public interfacing networks to allow them to get a hold of operational technology. So operational technology is the actual machinery of critical infrastructure or industry. And like you said, this has been a long time vulnerability. And these groups are not government agencies or parts of the Russian government, but some of them have connections to Russian military intelligence who are allegedly did help stand up some of these hacktivist groups.
Mm-hmm. And then is there anything there to indicate that something like this there may be imminent disruption, or is this a background kind of ongoing persistent threat?
Yeah, I think they are warning. They're basically telling these critical infrastructure operators that they need to stop using these public facing their virtual network that allows these groups to take advantage to actually get a control of the machinery of this critical infrastructure. This has been a long time vulnerability that CISA has pointed out. And part of the problem is that a lot of the industry, including critical infrastructure operators, which are primarily, or most of them like power or private industry, they just have not been implementing these security protocols that would block these hacktivists getting access to the actual critical infrastructure operations.
Mm-hmm. Cybersecurity professionals tell me that a lot of companies, including public utility companies, look at this and say, ramping up security is very expensive and we may not even be targeted. And we may not even know that all this security spending is working. And so they are willing, it seems to me, like based off what I hear, these companies are much more willing to endure the risk on the front end. And then if they get targeted, spend a lot of money on the back end trying to solve the problem. So it seems to me like that is the case. And that's pretty widespread. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on because there's this U.S.-Mexico water treaty that Mexico has been violating. And what's the latest here?
Mexico and U.S. officials are scheduled to meet today to negotiate some water deliveries from Mexico to Texas under that 1944 water treaty. This is after the Trump administration threatened to impose a 5% tariff on imports from Mexico if they did not deliver 200,000 acre feet by the end of the month. And I think, as we've covered before, Mexico is significantly behind on those water deliveries on their side of the treaty. And even if they wanted to, I don't think they have the capacity to actually meet that deadline. I think that's why these negotiations are happening. I think the Trump administration is likely to implement these tariffs unless there's some other deal that Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is able to make with the Trump administration.
Yeah, and we should note as well that one reason why Mexico most recently has not been giving this water to the United States is because parts of their country have been under a severe drought as well. All right, let's go ahead and move on. And Robert, I'll just let you take it on from these anti-Trump Republicans.
So this group called the Save America Movement Political Action Committee, they sent out a press release and they announced plans to spend $100 million to fund Democratic candidates in 60 House elections next year. And the idea here is they want to defeat Republican incumbents in those 60 seats. They said the strategy is to begin spending early. They're talking February of next year, when spending blitz for the election normally happens in the months ahead of the actual election. And they said their strategy is to create a perspective in the minds of voters before the Republican incumbents even begin their own campaigning, with the idea of damaging the Republican brand. And from what I could find, this was started by a group of Never Trump Republicans and Lincoln Project founders. And I think this is a response to what we've covered over the last few months, these structural hurdles that Democrats are facing in going into next year, even though the base case is a likely at least House flip. And then Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker yesterday signed the Illinois Bivens Act into law. And this would allow individuals and groups in Illinois to sue individual federal agents who are conducting immigration enforcement in the state. And with I think the idea of deterring future federal deployments into Illinois.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's more to come on that as well. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep. And we have a lot to cover today. And one reason for that is because they're puzzle pieces that are being put together right now by the Trump administration. We will cover that. Let's go ahead and start with this U.S. Army standing up this Western Hemisphere Command. So what the Army has done is they've taken 3 4-star commands. So that's U.S. Army Forces Command, U.S. Army North, and U.S. Army South, and they have combined them into one Western Hemisphere Command. And this is part of Secretary of Defense /War, Pete Hegseth's plan to reduce some of these 4-star billets. He's basically taking 3 4-star general billets, combining them into one. And this is also a part of the Army's transition to streamline planning and operations for the Western Hemisphere. This is very important, and we have already seen the start of this shift. We're going to see a lot more of it. We're going to talk about Peter Zeihan as well, but one thing I just want to note, it's funny, I was listening to a podcast earlier this year with Peter Zeihan on it, and the host of the podcast said, Peter, you're very famous for making a bunch of bad predictions, and which apparently is true. One thing that Peter Zeihan says in his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, is that the United States is going to be forced basically to retreat or to retrograde into the Western Hemisphere. And we're going to talk about a number of things, but I bring this up because A, I think he's right. I think he's undoubtedly right. And B, it kind of goes back to this whole concept of the Trump administration building Fortress North America. And that theory or concept says you make North America impenetrable, or you try to make North America impenetrable. I think that's why we're seeing these ramped up operations on the U.S. coast and in the Caribbean, especially, even reaching down into Central and South America. And then you harden as much as possible the Western Hemisphere. And there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about on today's show that add some data points to that. But I'll keep that in the back of your mind as we move on. All right, Jared, let's go ahead and move on. Artificial intelligence is going to revolutionize parts of our military, obviously. And one area where that's going to be is what, ship maintenance?
Yes. This is going to be ship building and ship repair planning. And the Navy has already integrated it. It's a program from Palantir. And the Navy reports that one of their major shipyards cut material review times from weeks to under 1 hour. So one of the other stats they gave, it was a 4-week process cut down to just 10 minutes, they said. And this is going to significantly streamline ship repair and production timelines because you don't have to have all those man hours. The AI does it. Now, the data and systems are also available for the AI to conduct predictive analysis and resource management to further streamline ship repair if the Navy chooses to integrate them. And that was something that we noticed as work center soups and technicians out on the ship is, hey, yeah, if you know the lifespan of these parts, so if you can predict it, you can get it. The AI can do that. We cannot.
All right. Thanks for that, Jared. We'll just continue moving on here in the order we've got in the report. Moving on here to NATO. I was just reading through some Russian media yesterday, and there's a Russian Navy commander who said that NATO military exercises in reconnaissance in the Arctic have increased by roughly 40% since 2020. And this is an area where the United States has really been behind the ball. You go back to the Obama administration, 2015, 2016, and at the tail end of his term, he sent a military team up to do basically a defense study of the Arctic to figure out how the United States can defend the Arctic. And this was at a time when Russia was already moving in, building and expanding existing military bases and infrastructure. And so, in short, it's not a surprise. Remember, defense of the Arctic goes into this Fortress North America concept. You're going to be hearing a lot more about that. And the Trump administration's goal is to make North America impenetrable as much as possible. So this includes the Arctic. Moving on, Lithuania declared a state of emergency because there are allegedly these Belarusian balloons floating over into Lithuania, and they're accusing these smugglers of using weather balloons to traffic cigarettes into Lithuania. The Lithuanian officials said the acts constitute a hybrid attack. Belarus a little more circumspect about it, but they did counter accuse Lithuania of using drones to drop "quote unquote" extremist material into Belarus. All right, let's move over to Ukraine because, Jared, apparently there was a member of the UK's armed forces who was killed in action in Ukraine.
Not in action. It was a, quoting, tragic accident while observing a test. So
okay, gotcha. My bad.
Not killed by Russian forces, but this is the first reported active duty member of the United Kingdom dying in Ukraine. Russia has not, I could not find any published official response to this, but they are at least observing it. I saw Pravda had an opinion piece on it. Then staying in Ukraine, Ukrainian President Zelensky told the media yesterday that he can hold new elections in Ukraine within 60 to 90 days, as long as the security for the vote is guaranteed by the U.S. and his European colleagues. Mm-hmm. And this is important because, A, that signals that they would potentially get rid of martial law, but this is also a prerequisite for Russia to come to the table for peace. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, that's been a big sticking point for opponents of the. Well, I would just say it's been a sticking point for critics of Zelensky, basically saying Ukraine's no longer a democracy. They're not even holding elections. So allegedly, I don't think anyone should get their hopes up, but it is important here that Zelensky is mentioning this. All right, let's move on here to this joint loitering drone that the United States and Taiwan are developing.
Yes. So this drone is supposed to enter its first flight test next month. Taiwan's making the bulk of it, except for the engine, which the U.S. will provide. That's fairly normal for airframes or for air platforms. The airframe is actually borrowed from an already functioning test munition that the U.S. uses, meaning this thing is ready to be mass-produced inside of Taiwan with the United States, and it's ready to integrate right away with U.S. systems.
Mm. And so that means it's on the cusp of mass production, and
yes,
China needs to be concerned about this drone.
Absolutely. The loitering drones, what you do with those is you throw them up and let them fly for the duration of their fuel, and then as soon as you need them, you can drop them in on ships. They're a problem for anti-ship missile defense. Incredible problem for it because you can have tons of them up. This thing, I actually got to look at it. It's very small too. I bet the radar cross section is very tough to find and then keep a track on when you're talking about mass producing them, having a ton of them in the air all at once or available to go in the air all at once. Good luck. Swarm tactics are always an issue for anti-ship missile defense. So
one of the things, Jared, you've talked about previously is China's strategy to overwhelm U.S. Missile defense on ships. And if they only, I don't know what the numbers are, but let's say they can only fire 10 anti-missile, air defense missiles or something. And so, okay, well, now you send 11 missiles and you overwhelm even by one. And so this is essentially the United States and Taiwan talking about doing the same thing to China.
Absolutely. And every time Taiwan's touched the drone regarding their defense, they immediately go to mass production. We covered that with their surface versions too.
And by the way, that overmatch would not just be 11 to 10. It would be multitudes.
Yeah, it'd be a lot more.
But I'd just say that as an example. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. All right. Moving over to Mexico. Down in southern Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel ambushed a Guatemalan military patrol on the Guatemala side of the border. And so Mexico and Guatemala have announced a plan to reinforce their shared border. Border security is important. Moving on here, this is actually very important. So Honduras had presidential elections on the November 30th. And the current president, Xiomara Castro, who's a leftist, is accusing, as of yesterday, President Trump of cheating, fraud, and manipulation in their presidential election. Now, election results as of last night have not been announced. The preliminary results show a guy named Nasri Asfura. He's a conservative National Party candidate. He's currently leading a left-wing party candidate by about 1.3% of the vote. However, election officials in Honduras are saying that maybe up to 14% of ballots are showing some signs of irregularities. President Trump did endorse Asfura, as did Argentine President Javier Milei, and Castro, the current president, is accusing the United States also of threatening to withhold foreign aid unless Asfura was elected president. This is another data point that ties back into Fortress North America and hardening the Western Hemisphere. So we have seen right-wing presidents being elected in Argentina, in Bolivia. Chile has elections coming up on Sunday. And right now, I think his name's Juan Antonio Cast. He's a right-wing party member. He's expected to win the Chilean presidency and take power back from Boric, who's basically a communist. And so this ties into this, Jared, I think you started calling it the Azul wave. Basically, you have these right-wing presidents winning elections in South America, across South America. And one reason for this is because the left wing and the communists, they've had massive problems with crime, massive problems with illegal immigration themselves, massive problems with economic conditions. And in some cases, voters are fed up. But this does appear to me, and I'm not saying that Honduran President Castro is correct here, but it does seem to me that if the White House were threatening Honduras with withholding foreign aid to Honduras unless the national party leader wins the election, it seems to me like that is at least possibly true. It's at least feasible. And it also ties into hardening the Western Hemisphere, because anytime you have these leftist presidents in South America, they're always wanting to do business with China. There's been massive amounts of Chinese foreign investment pouring into these countries in order to gain influence, especially over elected leaders. Chinese espionage rings, they pretty famously embroil foreign leaders in these money-making schemes and businesses and investments and tying up personal finances in their relationship with China. Of course, once you're embroiled in that, you want the gravy train to keep rolling. You do not want your country to move farther away from China, because it means your personal finances are threatened. Jared, anything else to add there?
Yeah, I do think that this is going to end up with going much further, particularly with the new national security strategies that came out, because the Trump administration explicitly said we're not going to push democratic values anymore. So if there is a problem in Latin America that needs to be solved and it's not democratic, push for it. The main point of the Western Hemisphere in this national security strategy is we're coming to work with you. We're the power, not China, not Russia, not Iran, us. Work with us. And it looks like he's going to push for it no matter what kind of government is in charge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this also goes back to this concept, and I personally have not seen anything from the Trump administration explicitly saying this, but it's in the tea leaves, I guess. But basically, some people are saying that President Trump has basically offered to, it's like you go back to the Cold War. There's a Soviet sphere of influence, and there's the U.S. and Western sphere of influence. And basically, it seems like Trump maybe has promised China their sphere of influence, Russia or Europe their sphere of influence, whichever part of that conflict comes out on top. And then the United States would be left with the Western Hemisphere. And it seems to me like that if we're going to avoid an outright war with China, I've seen recently Chinese officials come out and say, look, we don't want conflict with the United States. We want cooperation with the United States. We want everyone to continue trading. And it does seem to me, if you were to divide up the world roughly into the Western Hemisphere, the Asian sphere of influence with China, and then the Europe/Northern Asia sphere of influence, Europe or Russia, whoever comes out on top there. I don't know, maybe Africa gets divided up. That may be something like that may ensure some short-term peace if these spheres of the world continue to trade. Any thoughts on that, Jared?
I do think that's shaking out. That actually was something that I mentioned a long time ago on the ship. But with Europe, in the national security strategy, there was not a backing away necessarily of influence. So it looks like the U.S. will still want basically a preferred relationship there. So even if Europe does come out over Russia, it will still technically be U.S. aligned as opposed to Eastern aligned.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. By the way, this guy, Nasri Asfera, he is a Palestinian Christian. So he's about to become the second president of Palestinian origin in Latin America. He will join Nayib Bukele, who's also, I believe, of Palestinian origin. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on. We're tracking 71 protests today. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to the early warning section. Guys, we're just going to go ahead and roll into early warning here. For a couple of reasons. Number one, here by the end of this month, I just had a meeting with Rob yesterday. We are going to roll out the new major update to the Forward Observer site specifically for early warning members. And in addition to this report and this briefing that you'll get every day, we're building open source intelligence tools that will help you connect to information. So we will no longer, we're not really a gatekeeper, but a lot of what we do is centralized because analysis has to be centralized. And so you get a lot of information from us. What we're trying to do is flatten access to information. So it doesn't have to come through us. It can come through open source intelligence tools that we're building, connecting you not just to national and strategic level information and intelligence, but also connecting you to local information. That is the big goal for early warning, is to push down your access to local information, have that stuff be automated as much as possible, and in many cases, as many cases as possible, enable you to automate your own intelligence feeds as an early warning member. So you can expect the first update to come at the end of this month. And so just want to let everyone know that's what we've been working on. It's another reason, one of the reasons why I've been out for so long as well, in addition to being sick. All right. With that, Robert, let's go ahead and jump into New Orleans because we've seen this federal law enforcement surge, and there's been a lot of pushback from left-wing groups, not quite to the level that we've seen in like Los Angeles and Portland and Chicago, but maybe that's coming. What's the latest?
So the operation now called Operation Catalula Crunch, formerly Operation Swamp Sleep, is now expanded to areas around Baton Rouge, the Baton Rouge metropolitan area. And this is coming from local media reports on some ICE operations occurring in Denham Springs, which is a part of that metropolitan area. There's also been what looks like a coming expansion of the anti-ICE activity. One of these groups in New Orleans, Union Migrante, that I've been tracking, they've stood up what they call the OHOS project, or the EYES project. They've been holding training events in neighborhoods throughout New Orleans. They've been training activists for these accompaniment operations we saw in other federal surges. And they, according to one of the activists who has attended these trainings, they've been holding role-playing sessions to train activists to collect activity reports and record enforcement operations. And this looks like they're in the process of building up the establishing a local intelligence network. And they're training these activists to collect this information using salute reports that they have been distributing, but also sending these intelligence reports through both neighborhood and citywide group chats. And this is a part of these TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, that have been spread by Chicago activists. They even created an operational guide that we covered last week. And this is the reason why the guide is important, is because while these activists have been providing direct training to other activists around the country, that guide is likely to act as a force multiplier for these anti-ICE activities, because they can spread the guide to more people than they can direct training.
Yeah, that's important. And just briefly, Portland and Seattle, Antifa, have had something like this for nearly 10 years now, that they have also spread to other parts of the country. Specifically, I'm talking about using salute reporting. Salute stands for size, activity, location, uniform, sometimes unit, time, and equipment. And it's at least from the Army, I imagine other branches use something similar as well. But it is a way to quickly and efficiently transmit key details about whatever you're observing. And that goes back to the talk, or normally goes back to a talk. And you inform your command, you inform your higher up of, hey, there's something out here that you need to know about. See something, say something. The original see something, say something. So this is very important that they're using this tactic. It's not new. We have seen this used in major cities by left-wing groups. It made its way into New Orleans. And another reason why this matters is because we've also seen the proliferation of these rapid response networks. And what happens is, I'll give you a story. So this is, I think, back in 2017. So it was back when I lived in downtown Austin. There was basically a flash demonstration from Patriot Front on the UT Austin campus, University of Texas at Austin campus. And within about just a few minutes, this Patriot Front demonstration was observed. And there was a group on campus at the time called Revolutionary Student Front. And they had basically a call and text tree. And that's how they got information out to a lot of people very rapidly. So someone saw that, took a picture, and sent it up the chain of this rapid response network. And then that picture in the text message was blasted out, and people called. And within about 10 or 15 minutes, you started having these left-wing activists and militants start to descend on this flash demonstration. Now, police arrived very quickly and broke it up, and Patriot Front just left. However, that's a really good example of how these rapid response networks have worked in the past. Now they're working against ICE, and it's in principle, it's the same thing. Someone observes an ICE vehicle or an ICE operation, they phone it in, they take a picture, they get on their signal chat and let everyone know. That gets sent out to the whole network, and then you start having these protesters pop up out of nowhere, leaving work, leaving their home, doing whatever, driving down there to go monitor, observe, accompany, protest, demonstrate, try to intervene, whatever they do. So that's kind of the big picture tactic of what's happening, and it's made its way to New Orleans. Robert, thanks for standing by. Please continue.
Yeah, and I think another important part about this OHOS project is that, according to this activist, they're also effectively acting as an analysis shop, the large group Union Migrante is. So they're not just allowing people to put these reports out without any verification. They're actually verifying and then distributing the reports themselves through these networks. So it's not just a distributed, unorganized intelligence network. They also effectively have an S2 shop within this organization that's verifying and distributing these reports. And then or last week, at the end of last week, the ACLU had filed a lawsuit against a law passed in Louisiana called Act 399. And that created a criminal charge for impeding or interfering with federal immigration enforcement. They dropped this lawsuit on Friday because the Louisiana Attorney General said that the law criminalizes only actual obstruction. And apparently this was holding back some of these activist groups from conducting these types of training and anti-ICE activities. And I think that now dropping this lawsuit means we are about to see a ramp up in some of the anti-ICE activity in New Orleans, similar, getting probably close to the level that we did see in Chicago and Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, keep in mind also these ICE agents, and I don't know how many of them there are at least hundreds of new ICE agents now, but there's supposed to be 10,000. And what was it, like a third of the applicants or something like that could not join ICE because they failed height and weight, or they failed PT or something like that. They didn't pass their PT test, which is significant. At any rate, over the coming months and years, we will see these ICE agents also start to ramp up in size, and imagine we'll see additional surges, not just in New Orleans, but Robert, how many? There's probably like another half dozen cities that the Trump administration has been talking about.
Yeah, they're right now on the expected list. The cities that they have mentioned at least includes Baltimore, New York City, Cincinnati, or Cleveland, Ohio, and I think they've also talked about going back into California. There was the delayed surge in San Francisco, but I think they've also talked about San Diego as well.
All right, thanks for that, Robert. Moving on, let's talk about this Peter Zion video. So he had a video up just a couple of days ago. I watched it yesterday, and then I watched it again this morning. And I'll let you just go through the facts, and then we'll break it down. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. So in this video, Peter Zion, his central point was that President Trump is not the cause of what he says is a 10-year period of deglobalization and global scale Great Depression that's going to occur between 2025 and 2035, but that Trump is speeding up this inevitable development. And he said this decade-long period of deglobalization is due to a multi-generation demographic inversion. Basically, the global fertility rate has dropped significantly, And he said that Trump is forward positioning the breakdown of the U.S.-led global economic model, because he's creating disincentives for industrialization outside of the United States through tariffs, but also not creating incentives for industrialization within the United States. One of the points he makes specifically is that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada are making it more costly for a lot of industry to build up within the United States, and a lot of nearshoring. And this is, in his words, put a pause on industrial construction within the United States.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for those details, Robert. This video, I'm trying to look up the name of it. It basically said, "Oh, global depression is imminent," and well, it worked on me. And he says a global depression is on the way. Global depression is coming sooner than expected. Peter Zion, if you want to go watch that video. And yeah, it's kind of a bombastic title, but it worked on me. I watched the video. There's some things that Peter Zion says that are compelling, like that part of the book, "In the End of the World is Just the Beginning," where he is talking about different demographic collapse. And I'm not talking about his prediction of imminent social collapse, national collapse of China, or any of these other things that he says that he's been saying for a while and just haven't happened yet. The things he does say are at least provocative. One area where I think he's absolutely right is the United States is eventually going to be forced into this Fortress North America strategy and having to retrograde much of its military presence from around the world. We're just not going to be able to afford it. We won't have the manpower. Maybe some of this stuff can be replaced. Maybe some U.S. presence can be replaced by drones. But I think, really we will have to focus on securing the Western Hemisphere for the United States. One other thing he does say is that this is a part of a long-term trend. He said we were always going to have a global depression due to basically demographic collapse. In the book, he says a handful of countries stand out as way better than others. One of those is the United States because of immigration. Another one is Argentina. I think he said France as well. I believe he said France. There a number of countries with moderately healthy or stable younger people, or the ability to have immigration, have younger people move into your country, he said, are going to fare better than others, at least in terms of demographic collapse. Now, I've also seen, I forgot who it was, but one of the financial analysts I follow said, at some point in the United States, we will have a recession or maybe worse, because when you remove all these illegal aliens, and I know it doesn't sound like it's going to be many millions, 10, 20 plus million by the end of the first Trump term. Of course, it doesn't sound like that. But he said he doesn't know the number, but at some point he said, you remove that much aggregate demand from the economy and you will have a recession, because 70% of our economy is consumer driven. And what I think it's something like a 5% drop in spending or something like that will push the United States into recession. So there's a lot of additional details that we could add on that, but I'll leave it there for now. And just remind everyone, Zion says this was always going to happen. Trump is accelerating this. He's not causing this, but he's accelerating this. And he said 2025 to 2035 was always going to be very difficult, because this is the 10-year period that we will see this global collapse. This is just what Peter Zion says. And he says it looks like Trump is trying to accelerate that so the collapse happens on the front end rather than on the back end. Now, one reason why you would want that to happen is because if you can position the United States, if you understand what's happening and you can begin preparing for it, and you can trigger the collapse in order to hurt other countries, like competitor countries who are not ready for it, then you can have an advantage. He doesn't say this, I'm just putting two and two together. Then you can have that advantage on the front end. Even though it's painful on the front end, you can build that advantage on the back end. I think that's a big takeaway from this Xeon video. Robert, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, he also makes a point about return to pre-Bretton Woods and the idea that we're going into a global order where there's no longer, free trade is no longer the engine of economic development, but rather we're returning to conflict over consumer markets. One, I think his key assumption here is that the United States will decide that it's more important to fight over consumer markets for U.S. industry, which is what Trump is his at least ostensible plan is to reindustrialize the United States and turn us not necessarily into an entirely export economy, but some type of balance at least going back to some of his economic advisors who wrote a lot about this right after the election, to kind of stave off the Triffin dilemma. But I think his key assumption is that this decision will happen, and the U.S. will decide that's more important than exporting U.S. dollars. I think he also said another important point. He said, quote, "So there are so many secondary naval powers that the U.S. now under in this prediction cannot guarantee freedom of the seas." One of the major parts of being a global hegemon is guaranteeing the global commons. That's providing security for trade routes and free movement within the ocean. And one of those things that we've seen over the last few years is that it's become, because of the advancement of drone technology, especially, it's become much easier for asymmetric power to develop, for groups that aren't a naval power or a primary naval power to disrupt even U.S. naval operations, like in the Red Sea and in the Suez Canal. And I think if we are headed toward a fortress North America, we could see a receding of that control of the global commons. And that has two, I think, major implications for the United States. One, we could see a disruption of supply chains, especially for things that the U.S. is dependent on imports for. And we will also see a significant increase in global insecurity and trade routes, especially as this asymmetry develops on the naval level that we've seen develop in ground combat, like in Ukraine with the major use of these FPV drones.
Mm. One thing, just two things, and we'll move on. One is Michael Every has been way out ahead on this. He's the senior global macro strategist at Rabobank, which is a Dutch multinational bank. I interviewed him, and it's fantastic. If you want to understand big picture what's happening to the balance of global power right now, go back and watch that. It's on our YouTube channel. But one thing he said that he's been way out front on is China's strategy is to control supply chains. And if you control supply chains, it kind of doesn't matter who controls logistics. It kind of doesn't matter who controls production, even though China does control production. If you control raw materials and supply chains, then you will essentially control global trade. So I think that's very important. And this is something that the Trump administration is going to have to solve and figure out for us, in whatever administration comes after him, because this is going to be a long-term problem. The other thing, briefly, Robert, let's just talk about the Triffin dilemma. Let's break this down. The Triffin dilemma says, and I think his name's Robert Triffin, back in the late 50s, early 60s, and there were people saying this before him, but he went to Congress and told Congress at the time, the United States as the world reserve currency will end, because it has to end, because the United States has to export dollars. That means that we have to buy things. If you want to export dollars around the world, if you want to have this dollar-based global financial system, which we have, the United States cannot be a net seller. Because when we sell things, we send our products abroad and we take in dollars. You cannot have a global currency where the producer of that global currency takes in its own currency. You have to export that currency, which means that America has to be net buyers, not net producers. And that's why we have exported all of our production all around the world and exported jobs around the world, because we have to be net buyers. We've got to get dollars out of the United States and get them into the hands of people all around the world. Otherwise, you do not have a global dollar-based financial system. He said the problem is eventually you will hollow out American manufacturing, or you will hollow out the American economy. If we no longer produce anything and all we're doing is spending dollars, that system is going to end, because we will simply run out of buying power. And that is essentially the Triffin dilemma. You can have a world reserve currency like the dollar, and it can be good for Americans for a long period of time. We're at the tail end of this. We're experiencing this right now. Our economy has been hollowed out to the point where this global dollar-based system is running out of steam. This is one thing the Trump administration is trying to fix by bringing back some production to the United States. So I just want to cover the Triffin dilemma there. I'm sure ChatGPT, and I'm sure there's tons of videos on YouTube that can break it down in greater detail. Robert, thank you for mentioning that. With that, let's go ahead and move on. Hit the last item here. And this is, there's some reports that U.S. officials at the Pentagon recently told their NATO counterparts that the Trump administration wants Europe to cover the majority of NATO's defense capabilities by the year 2027. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's nothing new. Trump has been signaling this to Europe for a long time. According to this, there are 5 anonymous officials who were cited. So we're talking about multiple sources here. I'm not saying it's true. It's at least feasible. According to these officials, if this deadline is not met, if Europe does not take over defense of their continent by 2027, according to these officials, they say the United States may stop participating in some of these NATO defense exercises. This, to me, is a lot more smoke than fire. This is classic Trump. It's the carrot and the stick. And the stick, he rarely follows through with the stick. And this is another area where you take Trump seriously, but not literally. I will note, however, that the White House has refused to comment. They did not comment on this, but a Pentagon spokesperson did tell reporters, quote, "We've been very clear in the need for Europeans to lead in the conventional defense of Europe." And European officials have also stated their goal is to have European countries be able to defend their continent by the year 2030. It appears to me like Trump is trying to speed that timeline up much sooner. With that, we do have some questions here, and we will get to them. First question: can these groups, this goes back to the Russian hacktivist groups, can these groups targeting our infrastructure essentially be considered modern day privateers? Robert, I would say if they're extracting money, then potentially. Otherwise, I would say they're more like, barbarians rather than privateers. What say you?
Well, as far as I understand, the Russian groups, they operate. So like we've talked before about China, they use these private companies, ostensibly private companies, to do their own cyber activities using like bounty systems. As far as I understand, Russia has something similar where they do have some relationship with these ransomware groups and these other cyber criminal groups in Russia. So you could, I guess, say that there's something like privateers. There are unofficial letters of marque, I guess, that the Russian government would be using, something like that to get these groups to go after U.S. and especially European critical infrastructure. Part of it is also they are, I think, independent. There are some independent operations that are like some ransomware groups that are specifically doing this for financial gain rather than just going after the U.S. critical infrastructure for strategic reasons.
All right. Yeah, I would note, the Roman Empire had something like 15,000 miles of paved road, and that is what enabled the Roman Empire to expand their commerce and have commerce all throughout the empire and even outside it. Ultimately, though, those paved roads that enabled their commerce were the same roads that barbarians used to march into Rome and sack Rome multiple times. I look at the internet almost as a very similar way. That's almost like our 15,000 miles of paved roadway, because yes, we do use it to run our economy and we do use it for trade, and digital products and services are entirely dependent upon it. However, the internet is the same roadways that enable us to trade and go out, are the same that enable foreign actors to come in. Something to consider. Robert?
Yeah, I think we might even in the near future see that start to reverse, because they are taking advantage of especially open facing networks, and there's a potential we could start to see not a destruction of the internet infrastructure per se, but a much more security focused privatization of networks. So we might see, due to just the proliferation of this cyber activity and their ability to access critical infrastructure, industrial operational technology, that's been another area these groups have targeted. We could start to see a sort of a reprivatization or a privatization of the internet and more silos, basically.
Yeah, protected networks. All right. Thanks for that. Why would we have NATO in the Arctic when it's specifically our territory, well, at least part of it? But strategically, why would we allow NATO into territory we claim when they don't recognize all of it as the United States? Well, the Arctic is owned a handful of countries have claims on the Arctic: the United States, Canada, I think the Danish, the Russians, Greenland, of course. Well, Greenland's part of Denmark, technically. China says they're what do they call it? An Arctic adjacent country, and that's why they're trying to gain access to the Arctic. So I think most NATO countries look at the Arctic as de facto belonging to NATO, or at least NATO countries. I think that's the reason why. Jared, anything important you need to add there?
Yeah, the logistics. It all comes back to logistics. The Arctic,
Iceland also. Go ahead.
yeah, the Arctic basically cuts the logistics train in half. So you have to secure it, especially as ice recedes.
Yeah, the sea routes as well. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Great point. What is the team's opinion on the national security strategy that was recently released, and what key takeaways and likely future trends would you draw from it? You know what, Frozen Nomad, first of all, good to see you. Second of all, let's do that in a separate video. Let's go through, Robert and Jared and I will go through the national security strategy. We'll pick out what we think is important to our community, what we think you need to know. We'll do a separate members only video for that, and we'll get that recorded and posted as well. All right, with 100 plus gigawatts of firm power set to retire by 2030 and only a fraction planned for firm replacement, what recent proposals or policy shifts, such as small modular reactors, new gas units, etc., show real potential to close the reliability gap by 2030 as renewable additions fall short of 24/7 demand. Well, Robert, this is something that you started talking about 2.5, 3, something like that 3 years ago. And it seems to me like small modular reactors, the backyard nukes, are a very promising solution. I don't know that there's the infrastructure. Permitting is a years-long process. So there's obviously any time you're dealing with power production, you got to deal with permitting. It's a giant nightmare. It takes forever. In addition to that, it's not just building new power generating infrastructure. It's also building the lines, connecting these new subdivisions, connecting these new factories to the power grid, because these things are not next door to power generation plants. And that stuff takes time as well. We've also talked about reconductoring, where these utility companies will go in and they replace, aluminum lines or something like that, or maybe copper aluminum lines with carbon fiber or something like that. It's called reconductoring. And that increases the electricity transfer efficiency, so you can get more juice out to these places. So there's a lot of things that need to happen, but this question is specifically about generation. Robert, anything that's going to actually close this gap? We're already dealing with power shortages. There are these AI data centers that are currently delayed by 2 years. They have the money. They just can't start construction because they're going to build the thing and they can't hook it up to the power grid. So go ahead, Robert.
I think the small modular reactor is probably the most promising. So Oklo, which is the big startup doing these SMRs, I think they've moved. We reported on this earlier this year. They moved forward the deployment of their first commercially viable one to next year. And if it takes off, I think that is the most likely way we'll actually close that gap. Because in the meantime, the Trump administration has been playing whack-a-mole with the Federal Power Act, keeping some of these coal power plants from retiring early. And they have been at least talking within the Trump administration about easing the permitting for these small modular reactors. The hurdle for actually getting small modular reactors onto these regional grids is at the state level. That's where the permitting for connecting to the grid goes. And they've had long timelines for connecting new projects, to the point where I think we reported on it last year, something like more than 70% of proposed projects just fall away because they take so long to get permits for connecting the grid that they just cancel the projects. So that the small modular reactor, though, could be used at like these AI data centers on site, so they don't have to connect to the grid. And that could help stave off some of this power shortage.
Realistically, is that going to be up in sufficient numbers by 2030 to make a difference?
If the 2026 commercially viable SMR does work out, I think they could scale that up. Because the idea behind the small modular reactors is that you can have anywhere from one of these reactors to multiple on site, and it's easily scalable and modular, as it says in the name. If it does work out, I think that's viable. But that remains to be seen until next year when Oklo actually deploys that SMR.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thanks for that. All right. What 3 intel books would you recommend for an aspiring U.S. Space Force intelligence officer? I'm pretty sure you're talking about Space Force there. Well, listen, intelligence is a broad field. There are a lot of disciplines and a lot of jobs that you can do in the intelligence field. I don't actually know what Space Force intelligence looks like, but I imagine it's probably about as broad as what the Army had. So, I mean, consider this. You could be You could be basically an all source intelligence officer. You could be an imagery, or you could be a signals intelligence, or, I don't exactly know what the Space Force has. I can take a look. So I would just say start with the basics. You've got to get the basics right. So a couple of things. There's the psychology of intelligence analysis. It doesn't matter what you do in intelligence. If you're a collector or an analyst, you have to understand how analysis works, and you have to be yourself a good analyst. It's by Richard Hoyer. It's called The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. Start there. Also, pretty much anything by Randy Fearson. He's got let's see, I don't have it nearby. I used to keep a copy on my desk. It is, if it's basically like the structured analytic techniques manual. He's basically got a handbook of structured analytic techniques. I would say start there. Those are the best two kind of like foundational books on that you should understand for intelligence. And then whatever you decide to specialize in, I can give you, probably some better recommendations. By the way, best of luck to you. Could you expand on the idea that tariffs are preventing the growth of U.S. manufacturing? Tariffs are preventing the growth of U.S. manufacturing. Well, I think the argument for the Trump administration is that you need to grow U.S. manufacturing, and the way to do that is by making imports more expensive than domestically produced goods. And so that's the reason why you have tariffs. You put tariffs on foreign goods because now these companies say, well, we're going to lose market share, and it's also going to be more expensive to buy our product, so we're going to be selling less. And they crunch the numbers and they say, well, at some point, this is going to become economically more feasible for us to build a factory in the United States, or to build one in Mexico or Panama or Costa Rica or wherever, and reshore our manufacturing. I'm not sure what the argument is that tariffs are preventing the growth of U.S. manufacturing. Maybe the tariffs on raw materials, making raw materials more expensive, importing components that you need to do the last mile production here in the States. I can see that argument. That said, I'm not trying to answer your question. I'm not an economist, but I answered that to the best of my ability. Jared or Robert, do you have a better answer than that?
Yeah, I think that was a question from our coverage of this Zahan video. His argument is that the Trump administration implementing tariffs on NAFTA effectively requires, his example was the automotive industry. So they have components that move across the border multiple times during different stages of production. His argument is that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada mean that U.S. car manufacturers paying a tariff multiple times as those components move across the border, and while they only have to pay one tariff for a component that comes from Europe or Asia. And he specifically says Asia is the main one here. And his argument is that it seems to be that it's taking capital away from building new factories in the United States, because they're having to spend capital on paying multiple tariffs. And while they need to produce cars now, so then they're just going to pay one tariff to bring a component from Asia to the United States.
I see. USMCA is getting renegotiated next year, so we could see potentially those tariffs come down or go away altogether.
Yeah, so Trump has been talking about that again. He's been saying that they're going to renegotiate next year.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that explanation. That makes sense. All right. How much of that energy permitting you mentioned is federal, and how much is state and local? I think we already answered this. Robert, you said it's almost all state.
Yeah, there's federal permitting, but the real hurdle is at the state level, because the states are deciding the permitting process for how they connect to the grids.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Anything the Trump administration can do other than put some political pressure on these states?
Basically, that's all they can do, is try to put pressure on the states to get this permitting done faster.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. All right, thanks for that. Last question of the day. Right in. A post from Unusual Whales yesterday posts that European officials are eyeing the nuclear option of dumping U.S. treasuries if Trump cuts Ukraine deal without allies, per Wall Street Journal. So I did see this. I will somewhat doubt that this happens. Let me just say this. On its face, I somewhat doubt it, but this is definitely not my main area of expertise. But let me tell you what this is somewhat reminiscent of. And this was really the nail in the coffin for the British Empire. The British Empire was already in collapse, but really it was the nail in the coffin for the British pound. Back in 1956, you have the Suez Canal crisis. And Egypt moved its military to take physical control of the Suez Canal. And you had France, you had, I think it was Egypt, France, Egypt, and maybe even Israel was involved. And they basically, Egypt took control of it. You had, France, Great Britain, and I think the Israelis were involved. And the French and the British said, no, we're going to take back control of this through military means. We're basically going to declare war on Egypt and go in and take it back. And the president at the time, Eisenhower, said, no, actually, I don't think you're going to do that. And Eisenhower threatened to sell off all of the U.S. pounds that were being held in reserve as part of our foreign reserves. And the threat alone tanked the pound. And basically, as a result of that, the Great Britain had to turn around, and I think a couple of years later or somewhere around that time, they had to get an IMF bailout, and it was just a massive problem for the British. And so the British and the French said, okay, yeah, maybe we will not do that. That, as soon as I heard that, it reminded me of the Suez Canal crisis. I don't think this is going to happen, but anytime you have a collection of countries threaten to sell off treasuries, it's going to be a BFD, a big freaking deal. So it's something that we'll keep an eye on. And actually, let's maybe look into seeing how likely this is. I think more likely than not, this is bluster, but that's my initial answer, and I reserve the right to change that if we look into it and it actually does appear likely. I think that's a huge deal. It's something that would send not just treasuries down, but obviously yields up, and that's something that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent does not want to happen. All right, last question here. Could anti-ICE QRFs be captured via bear bait into action, arrested en masse along with their S2 shots? Well, anytime you see that, you're going to want to infiltrate that. And there's a couple of things that you can do. And this all goes back to the fundamentals of intelligence. There's really only two things that you do in intelligence. It's either collection or it's analysis. And one reason why we have OPSEC is to deny information during that collection process. That's why we have operations security. We want to protect our friendly indicators. We want to protect friendly information from being collected by enemy or adversary observers or by threats in general. ICE obviously does have an OPSEC plan, and they have an OPSEC program, and they're trying to deny that information. So one other part of OPSEC, though, is not just denying friendly indicators. It's also deliberate deception or military deception. So there is a case where you may not have to necessarily arrest the S2 shop if they're not violating any laws, but you can gum up their engine by putting bad fuel into their engine, or putting bad information into the engine. And that's one thing that deception does. The other part of this is analysis. And well, we'll save that for maybe another talk. Robert, in terms of them violating laws, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a prosecutor. I actually don't know what laws they could be violating, but I would imagine if they're violating federal law, the FBI should pretty much have carte blanche to go in and arrest these people, correct?
Correct. And they have been very careful about staying on the lawful side of that line for most of their activities. I think most of the arrests have come from trespassing on federal property, like at the Portland detention facility. And there was an interpretation or a change to the federal rules about what can be done on federal property, specifically to go after people that were trespassing on the Portland detention facility. I think the rule was something like conducting potentially unlawful activity while masked was something they could be arrested for now. And some of the other things that people have been arrested for are actual obstruction, so like ramming CBP and ICE vehicles, but otherwise what they're doing is perfectly legal.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine, couldn't there be, it seems like conspiracy to stalk. I think stalking is possibly a law they could be breaking. There, of course, is this line between, yes, you can observe police. You should be able to follow police, not just be forced to observe from one location. But at what point does that actually become stalking? Does there have to be some kind of threat or intimidation that goes along with that observation? do you think?
Probably. And I mean, there have been people that have been arrested in Chicago or threatened with arrest for following and trying to do these de-arrests. That's one place where people have been arrested, is at physically interfering. And I think it's what this Louisiana law is to create at least a state level charge for people who physically interfere, like doing these direct action demonstrations where they try to de-arrest people.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Great questions as always. Good to be back. Everyone, hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thanks for tuning in here. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning for members back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.